All right, folks, we're going to kick off tonight's Evenings with Artifacts. We are delighted to have two amazing guests tonight to discuss downsizing and the science and heart beside downsizing. I'm going to turn it over to Ellen to do the intros, and we'll kick off the conversation. As a reminder, please feel free, if you have questions during the presentation, please pop them into chat, and we will address them either if we have a pause during the discussion or at the end. So once again, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and over to Ellen for the intros.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Happy to have you all here. We have a special panel today. Well, panel? Two people? Is that a panel? I'm not sure. But our topic this evening is something that can be a little bit challenging, which is intergenerational experience and conversations around downsizing. And we wanted to tackle it a little bit differently. And so we have two brilliant speakers today, one that's going to be covering it from a storytelling side of the equation, and the other is going to be telling it from the science. So let me introduce Margit Novack. Margit, I actually wish I had your book in front of me. If you have a copy, hold it up. I've actually gifted Margit's book many, many times, called Squint. I highly recommend it. You're going to catch a little preview of it tonight. It's funny, it's fast, and I think everyone should read it. So Margit is an industry leader and pioneer in senior mood management, and she's also an author, as I just explained. She opens our lives to the abundant possibilities of later life. And as an aside, this isn't in her bio. When I first met her, it was really captivating how she said to me, "Ellen, I'm in my 70s, and I'm living the best life I've ever led." And I was thinking, oh, I just want to be her. She pairs profound and memorable personal stories with larger themes like tonight's downsizing, caregiving, forgiveness, estrangement, and more. And she shows that with the right perspective and revisioning, the future is rich with possibility. Margit, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
And Dr. Daryl Appleton, hello. She is the innovative, and I was shocked by this word in here. I'm like, modern day doyen of wellness, and is reshaping corporate, academic, and individual visions of wellness. You may have caught an article that she actually contributed here at Artifacts. Check out our articles by Artifacts and click on the aging theme. It was a gold star. Lots of people very happily writing us about that one. She has a consulting firm that holds an exclusive clientele of global brands, Ivy League surgical programs, Fortune 500 executives, pro athletes. Like, let's just be very happy that she's setting the world stage for us in a better fashion. But they're all looking to elevate their processes towards personal and professional success efficiently and effectively. So Dr. Daryl Appleton, thank you for joining us.
I'm very excited to be here tonight. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. So tonight's format, if you've been tuning in to Evenings with Artifacts ever, is a little bit different. We will have Margit lead us through a series of 3 stories, and to each one, Daryl will come in and talk about the science behind it. So both of them are providing unique tools for us. Stories are tools, science are tools, and together they give us the means to actually rationalize the experiences we're going through and get through them safer and saner for everybody, and especially in downsizing. So with no further ado, we are going to kick off with the first story, and I titled it Getting the Job Done. Margit, over to you.
Hey. It happens so often to me as a senior mood manager. I would be having the tour of a new client's home, and the client would be showing me around her home, and there was a picture of her and a young girl, and she would say, "This is me and my daughter Ellen at our old house. I loved that house." And her daughter, who was also at the visit, goes, "No, Mom, that's me, Joan." And my client, the woman, stops talking. Her face falls. And I feel like saying, why did you correct her? She was telling a story about how much she loved the house. Did you see how much she changed? She stopped talking when she was corrected. And I think it is instinctive by children. It is so discordant for them to see their parent be inaccurate. They jump in without thinking, because I think if they thought it, they would choose to be kind. And that's a theme that I think as family members and caregivers, it's a theme that's important to remember, because so often the need to get it done and the desire to be kind conflict, or they appear to conflict. I remember getting a call from my Aunt Betty. Margie, dear, I'm Margit, but when I was little, I was Margie. I'm moving. Can you come help me? So my Aunt Betty, who had no children who were alive, had moved to Florida. I lived in Philadelphia. She had moved about 9 years earlier, and now she was moving from her independent living apartment to in a high rise in Florida to a senior living community where she would be going into independent assisted. She had 24/7 caregiving help where she was going. And I flew down. I took a day off from work, 2 days off. I was determined I'm going to come in and we're going to get this done. I knew that she had moved in to a guest suite at the community 2 weeks earlier, and she was already living there, and then they were giving her loaned furniture. My job was to help her decide what was going to stay in her old apartment, get things moved to her new apartment, get the old apartment moved out. And I thought, well, this won't be hard. I'm a senior move manager. This is what I do every day. But I was also a family member, and all throughout the weekend, those two roles collided. I arrived and we started working, and some of the things went really smoothly. There were things that I call reality checks. I'm looking at a 5-foot tall desk, table lamp, and I'm saying to Betty, this is a really big lamp, and it's still in a box from when you shipped it here 8 years ago. And she goes, I might need it. And I said, well, you haven't needed it in 8 years. You haven't unpacked it. And she laughed and she said, you're right. But other reality checks needed to be handled differently. When we looked at some of her sets of dishes, I said, there's service for 12 formal dishes. She goes, I might have a dinner party. I could have pointed out, but I knew I shouldn't say, Betty, you have people make all your meals. You're not going to be throwing dinner parties for people. But to say that would have hurt her. Another time she said we were looking at clothing, and there were pantsuits that I knew would not fit her because she now used disposable underwear. And she would say, oh, I love that pantsuit. And I could not say to her, but you can't wear this anymore because of your disposable underwear. So there were things that I allowed to go, even though I knew they wouldn't be used, because I knew there could be room for them. And I chose to be kind and say, it wasn't, did I do perfect downsizing? If there was room in the new apartment, what difference did it make if she would never use it again? So there were things that went because there was space, and being kind was perhaps more important than doing a perfect job. So we went on, and I had hired actually a colleague to help with some of the packing. And I found myself saying to the colleague, if when you're sorting through her clothing, you see any underwear that's torn or soiled, throw it away. Don't let it go to the new place. I would never have thrown away a client's clothing, no matter what its condition. It belonged to the client. That was not my role as a senior move manager. But here I was, family member, senior move manager, and the roles kept colliding. So we do get the things moved over to her new apartment, and it's Sunday evening, and I'm bringing over the last load, which is going to be artwork. And I drop Betty off at the front door, and I got a hotel dolly to bring up the last things. And I got to the apartment and she wasn't there. So I looked all over. I started going all over the second floor, which was where her apartment was. I found her in a different wing on the first floor with her walker. And I said, Betty, what happened? And she said, I got lost. And she did have her new apartment number on her walker. She had it on a piece of paper around her neck. But I didn't point this out because what was the point? She hadn't realized it. And if she had, she was just too tired and too confused to figure out how to get back to her apartment. So I took her back to her apartment and I thought to myself, I see this happen all the time. Family members swoop in because they're taking time off from work, time off from their own family. They want to get the job done. And they put in really long days. And my aunt had put in really long days. And I knew as the move manager that the effects of stress and fatigue on anyone, but especially on an older adult, are going to be confusion, disorientation. She's in a new home. We've had really long days. It's very emotional. So what I was seeing that Sunday night was Aunt Betty at her worst. And I realized I had contributed to that. And I had seen many family members inadvertently do the same thing, not for lack of caring, but because they have a need for expediency. They need to get the job done. They're taking time off. There's a lot to happen that has to happen. So I repeatedly had lessons that weekend. The next day, I was leaving. I came over for breakfast and she said, oh, honey, you've worked so hard this weekend and we haven't even had time to have lunch. And I'm thinking, she wants lunch? But that is what she wanted. She wanted to take time for us to be together. Her agenda and my agenda had been different. And then she really felt like the Aunt Betty I had known. And yet in the next sentence, she was confused about whether she was in Florida or still in Philadelphia. And the juxtaposition of how quickly she could change was striking. Later that day, she said to me, you know, my memory is so bad. I'm just not the person I used to be. And I didn't deny to her that she was changing because I think that would have been condescending. I said, you know, I've noticed some changes. I think you're about 90% of the Aunt Betty that I know. And I think 90% is fine with me. And she smiled and said, I guess 90% is okay.
I think it's
So that was
interesting.
90% of Aunt Betty.
And I love that story. And I think it probably mimics so many experiences that people have had and are having at any stage in their life, whether we're talking about something in the corporate world, whether we're talking about something with young children or in traffic. Like, we're talking about emotional regulation, and we're talking about this idea of when I am overwhelmed, like you were talking about, Margit, of this idea that it's highly charged. What it does in our brains is it creates this fight or flight. Now, all of a sudden, we're fighting each other rather than rationalizing the problem. And I say to my clients all the time, like, there's a difference between responding and reacting. And if we take a second to respond and remember that somebody is also going through something that is incredibly difficult, maybe the most difficult thing that they've ever done, but probably the most difficult thing they're doing that day for sure, that it's really important for them to feel safe. And this idea of psychological safety is something that feels really woo-woo, right? It feels really like, oh, okay, psychological safety. But what that means is I'm giving you space to be human in a very human, difficult moment. And again, whether that's in the corporate world, whether that's new parents, whether that's, you know, dealing with a difficult family member or a not difficult family member at any stage in their life, allowing people to have the benefit of the doubt. And for yourself too, creating psychological safety within yourself of what can we do to prepare for something that's going to be emotionally charged. If you are the helper in this situation and you are the family member, because sometimes it's a little bit different when we put our job hat on, it like comes with the coat, it comes with the hat. But when we're family member, set expectations with yourself and maybe with that other person, and being able to define success, being able to say, all right, if we get 5 things moved, I'm happy with that, versus let's get it all done. Let's have it all happen. And I find that when we judge ourselves versus epic failure or epic success, things start to fall apart. So there's also systematic ways that we can put in place to have a better outcome emotionally, especially. And caretaking ourselves is really important. And it's funny because we were on this call before just chatting, and we were talking about the very Carl Rogers of meeting people where they're at. And I think this like speaks to that. And we were talking about small business stuff and we were talking about artifacts, but we were really talking about this experience of when someone is asking for help, it is our job as the helper to ask somebody what they need and to not judge them where they're at, but to meet them there. And if we're the ones asking for help, sometimes it's great to have clarity about where we're at. And I think that's a really wonderful thing. And there's almost a process before the process that can kind of take place and make moves like this a little bit easier. And I know, Margit, you're going to talk about some of the more difficult transitions of getting into gifts with strings attached and things that now are not just as cut and dry as, okay, we need a little bit more time emotionally and we're a little bit fatigued, but might actually have a little bit more emotional charge to them. And I think that this story is one of my favorites because it speaks to some of the nuances of how difficult it can really get when we're downsizing.
Yeah. Well, that was a great lead-in to Gifts with Strings. When my husband and I were moving about almost 40 years ago, we did not at the time own a microwave oven. I know it seems hard to believe. And we were pretty sure we didn't really want to use one. We said, oh, we won't use it. But my mother-in-law said, for the new home, I'll give you $200 for a radar range. That's what she called it. In those days, it had radar rays. So she said, we'll give you $200. And I said to Bill, well, if we don't get the microwave oven, will we still get the $200? And he said, of course. And then it became pretty clear that the offer was not $200. The offer was $200 for a microwave oven. So that is how I got the first microwave, which of course we've not stopped using microwaves since. But it was my first example, but not my last, with Gifts with Strings. And I love that term because we give things away, but we actually still hold on to them. I remember I was working with a client who had a burled mahogany highboy, and it had a beautiful burl pattern on it, and it was a big piece of furniture with a lot of drawers and a lot of storage, and she felt it was too large scale for her new home. So she offered it to her children, and she was delighted when her daughter said that she wanted it because it was going to be a dresser for her granddaughter, Megan. So my client was thrilled it was going to be used. She has it shipped to her daughter's house. And several months later, she goes to visit. And she said, I'm going to go look at the highboy. So she goes upstairs into Megan's bedroom. And there is the highboy painted blue. So her first reaction was, how could you have painted this beautiful burled mahogany? And then she said, I had to zip it. I had given it away. And this was such a great story because I not only saw it all the time with clients, I experienced it so much with myself. I remember there was a piece of furniture I inherited from my grandmother. And when my oldest son got an apartment, got a house, I asked if he wanted it. And I was delighted when he said he did. And years later, about 5 years later, I visited, and that table was not in good condition. And I was torn. One reaction was, but it was in such good condition when I had it. And the other reaction was, but I didn't want to keep it. And it was part of his house and his life. Furniture should be used. That was the point of it. And I knew that I had that battle within myself. My Aunt Betty, that I just talked about, had 3 husbands, and she had a lot of diamond rings. And many years ago, when my sons were little, she said to me, I'm not going to be giving the diamond rings to you. I'm going to give them to my niece, Miriam, who was then 5. She said, because you have sons, and I'm afraid that when the sons grow up, they're going to meet a girl and want to get married, and they're going to use the diamond ring as the engagement ring. And then they're going to get married, but they might get divorced, and then the ring will leave the family. So she's going to give it to Miriam so the ring would stay in the family. And years later, as Miriam grew up, got married, I did not have the heart to say to Betty, she had a son. And when this son grows up, he might meet a girl and need a diamond ring. And he might use your ring, give it to the girl, but then they might get divorced. I mean, Betty was trying to control what happened to her jewelry in the grave, from the grave. And I understand that desire, but it is such a slippery slope. Not the desire to control from the grave, but the desire to have things we give to people treated and handled in a way that we want. The fact is, there are no guarantees. We have to give freely, or we are opening ourselves up to major family discord over things.
Mm.
Things are not worth having family discord over. But it is so easy. When my grandmother offered me things, I understood that I was accepting a responsibility and an obligation. But I believe I am the last generation that is that manipulated by guilt. If you are my age and you say to yourself, will your children hesitate to sell, buy, donate, or whatever, anything you give them? I think you will all say, oh, they would absolutely get rid of it. So as a generation of boomers gets ready to downsize and dispose of things, it really behooves us to make sure that we are giving things without strings. Family relationships are precarious enough and challenging enough. This is something we can control, to let go of things emotionally, not just physically, and to not give gifts with strings.
And Margit, I think you sent us that article in the New Yorker or something about how I think it was 30% of adult children are estranged from their parents or a family member. And you know, that's a trauma, right? On a lot of levels for a lot of different people. And it's a horrible thing. And sometimes maybe it's necessary, right? No judgment. But I do think that if it's avoidable with things like this, why wouldn't we avoid it? And I love that you brought up control, because that's what this is. And it's not even control, it's the illusion of control. Because like, what can we actually control ourselves? And even that, how much control do we actually have over that? And I think that your level of self-awareness, even in the stories that you're telling, is something that we need to take notice of. Because if we're not self-aware enough that we're doing it, or that that's what's happening, it's very hard to address, and it's very hard to understand and have that empathy or that grace for that other person of why they might be doing it. Doesn't mean you need to accept it. Doesn't mean you need to have guilt with it. But I'm a geriatric millennial. We have no guilt on a lot of things. But I do think that there's something to be said about understanding what's happening so then you can problem solve. And there's something even beyond this, right? And it goes into evolutionary psychology of why this happens. This isn't just a controlling mother-in-law or, you know, somebody that wants to, you know, manipulate you from the grave. Although I know a few people that might fall into that category. But it actually stems from genetic Darwinism, or something that's called kin selection. And it was studied in Cambridge, and it's actually very well studied, about this idea that our genes will win out, just like in Darwinism, but so will our stories, this lineage of favoring someone or something. We want the diamond ring to continue on because it's a part of our story that we want to live on. We want it to be part of the natural selection. We want it to be something that continues forth for generations to come. So it's not the ring, it's a piece of us. And that, I think, is something that's so embedded. And there's research of why specifically mother-in-laws and daughter-in-laws don't get along, because whose Christmas cookies are going to win, whose holiday traditions are going to win out. So it becomes like this deeper conflict ingrained in genetics, which arguably is survival on some level. So that's, I think, why some people feel so deeply about things. And when you're mitigating this, I think it's really important to be self-aware around that it goes so deep for somebody. And we could probably get into a whole other artifacts on how do I have difficult conversations? What does that look like? What does that mean? Where do I start? I think the first place that I would tell people to start is understanding that's what's happening. So being incredibly self-aware that these are the symptoms that are coming up. I work with a lot of surgeons and docs, right? The symptoms are nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, but the underlying issue, the diagnosis is something different. So somebody controlling a thing, the diagnosis might actually be something like genetic Darwinism or something else that's happened in their life where they haven't felt seen or heard, and this is their time to do that. And once you have that, then you can start to craft an empathetic and hopefully productive conversation and response forward, because it does play on legacy and it does play on relationships and it does play into some of these really important and very, very deep-seated human needs. And I'll kind of leave you at this before we get into our last one, but I have learned in my many years of psychology, there's two main things that human beings need in order to feel happy, healthy, peaceful, however you define that in your life. They need to feel seen and they need to feel heard. And at some point, if they feel like you're throwing their things away, it might feel like you are throwing them away. And that's how deeply it goes into it. Now, part of that is their job to detach themselves from the things because they are more than just their things, but also as caregivers or maybe somewhere in that sandwich generation of like, I have young kids, I don't want any more things, but like, I don't want to like disrespect your things as well. Understanding that and being empathetic to that can help you guide that conversation a bit more to help with legacy and relationships, which is what we're talking about as our final story.
As a move manager, I heard lots of great stories, but sometimes some stories stand out. And what was interesting to me is often clients wouldn't get the whole story. They would tell the story, but they wouldn't always see the big picture. As an outsider, and especially with the perspective of senior move management, sometimes it was my job or my privilege to see that bigger picture. I have two friends who described their caregiving for their parents. Both parents died very close together, and the two sisters were responsible for going through their parents' belongings and divvying up and deciding what would happen to the things. Some were sold, some went to family members, and they have a very good relationship. They had no problems identifying what was going to happen to each thing. But there were two items that both women wanted. One was a ring that their mother had purchased. It wasn't a diamond ring or an engagement or wedding ring. It was a ring that she bought in a store in Paris, where they spent a lot of time. And the other was a silver vase. And their mother had gotten it at an auction and was very proud of it. And both girls, both women, wanted both items. So I said, "What did you do?" And they said, "Well, we get together every January 1st. One of us took the ring and one of us took the vase. And we get together every January 1st. And the person with the vase fills it with a dozen white roses, which were their mother's favorite flower, and they exchange." And I loved the story. And that was the story to the sisters. And I said to them, what a legacy you have given your children. You have shown by your example that relationship is more important than ownership. That is, you can say that in words, but you've demonstrated it in how you handled this. And that is such a fabulous legacy to give to your children. And it was interesting that they hadn't seen it that way. To them, well, this is how we solved it. They didn't see the bigger picture. And that's often something that we who have the privilege of listening to stories can sometimes realize that those stories are even bigger than what the person who is telling the story thinks it is. And then it becomes really exciting because the story becomes so universal. So the two sisters have 5 children between them. And at some point, those 5 children will have to figure out what to do with their parents' belongings. I have no question that they will do it beautifully because their parents have set such an elegant example of how relationship is more important than ownership. And when we can take things and use them to teach that kind of life lesson of what's important, that's really honoring the things. That's using things in the best way they can ever be used. It is not keeping things forever. To give things the ability to teach that kind of lesson, that's really honoring those items.
And it's such a beautiful reminder, because how many of us get attached to our cars, our houses, our statuses on like a very macro level sometimes, down to the things that we're downsizing or getting rid of. And this is why I love Artifacts. This is not a plug. This is a very true statement, because it allows the story to be at the forefront. And it reminds us why we kept these things to begin with. And I think that there's something beautiful about legacy when it's done in a way that has intention infused behind it. And lots of the research and the science will show you that intention absolutely matters. It matters in behavior choice or modification. It matters in emotional regulation, right? Like I'm choosing to respond rather than react. And I think that we constantly need these reminders because we get lost in stuff. And stuff doesn't just mean our literal stuff. It means our schedule stuff. It means our family stuff. It means our friend stuff and everything in between. That quote, like, don't be too busy making a life that you forget, to live a life worth living. And I think that's such a beautiful example. I also love how these women figured this out and, to your point, created a new story entirely. And the item allowed for there to be a continued legacy, because now the story is scaffolding. Now it evolves in itself. And like, there's some beauty in that storytelling that's unmatched, more than this ring in Paris could ever, purchase price. Like there's something to it that's really wonderful. And the science of storytelling shows that when we storytell, areas in our brain actually light up with pleasure. We get dopamine hits from telling stories, and you want them to be positive stories. Sometimes we also can like get there too with negative stuff, and you can like trauma bond in a not so great way. Misery loves company. There's science behind that. But I do think that, again, intentionally pointing your feet in the direction and walking to a shared legacy, a shared relationship, a shared story for your family, for yourselves, for your children, is something that we actively need to pursue. And sometimes I don't think that we always do that. We think it will happen organically, but there is effort and energy that needs to be put into these things. And really, really and truly, Artifacts is kind of this almost like journaling prompt I wish every therapist and everybody in psychology had, of like, not only figure your thoughts out about this thing, but figure out how you feel about it and what you want to communicate. Like, it's a really great way to connect families and self-inquiry and this idea of managing your things in so many different ways, but especially psychologically and emotionally and in that relationship level. So I think that there's a ton of things that we can learn from these stories and hopefully this science for sure, because it can intersect in so many different ways. And I know that when we were chatting in our kind of our pre-meetings, we were like, and this and that and this, and there was so much we wanted to talk about. So I hope that these stories and these sciences did it justice for the things that people were thinking about and some of the stuff on everybody's mind.
It's fabulous. I mean, we've now heard from the dopamine dealer, Margit. Thank you for these lovely dopamine stories and these lovely hits of dopamine. And Daryl on all things psychology and science, and I think that there are some themes I want to even revisit on this, because I think it's really important. One of the things that science does for people, and whatever version of science this is it helps you understand that there is something behind this. There's a root cause, and it gives you a name for it. It gives you a concept, a structure, that framework to understand I'm not alone. This is a thing. I can learn more about it. But then on the other side, the story side, I think that stories are powerful tools. I don't think anyone that came tonight will forget Margit's stories. I remember them from her telling them to me when we first met in Atlanta. Like, those stories stuck with me. And I think that that's part of why we wanted to do this tonight, is we want those stories and this science and these concepts to be tools that you take away with you. And I also think, Margit, something that stuck out about one of your stories, I'm sure it came with experience as a senior move manager, but one of them that struck me was you're able to recalibrate the definition of success and the job done and on the go, right? And that flexibility and agility and self-awareness, I think that's actually a theme that permeated all of your stories. And I experienced this with my own mother. My parents were, in theory, going to downsize, and I checked if they're on tonight. They're not. They'll probably watch this recording, so I'll be very careful. But they were going to downsize after 45 years in the same home, which is frankly terrifying to my siblings and to me, because that's a lot of time to hide things in every nook and cranny and forget that they were there, right? But I went home and I wanted to artifact with my mother and help her let go of some of the items that she wasn't going to be able to take with her. My parents' home looks like this country bed and breakfast full of antiques that my mom's carefully curated and designed, and it's beautiful, but they couldn't all make the cut. And so we're going through things. And what was interesting and what I wrote about, and I'll put the link into chat, we had to really concentrate on what was my definition of success from this experience, because I was that child swooping in to their environment. What was my mom's definition of success, and what was my dad's definition of success? And they were not the same. And so it was this really tricky dance trying to satisfy all parties and keep it harmonious. And, and this isn't a plug, but it is a plug. Artifacting got us through it. And we had to be able to share some of that with other siblings, and even with entities where we were going to downsize the items to donate or consign and other things. But I think that agility and that defining success is a concept that really struck me about all of these stories. We will take any questions. Oh, sorry, Heather, did you have any notes that you wanted to pop up? Sorry.
No, I've been popping some of the links to the chat, folks. So if the articles that Daryl and Ellen have referred to, they are in chat for your reference. And we do have a couple of questions in chat already. The first one is for you, Margit. What's the significance of the title Squint in your book?
Squinting is an artist technique of manipulating how they see things, so that a lot of things get blurry where you can hyper focus on one or two things. And I felt that looking at my past life, my childhood, my professional life, my transition into a new phase in retirement. In a way, I was doing squinting. I was focusing on certain aspects of my life. There's also the multiple squint in art, where someone might look at a whole range of work they've done and again apply a squint to see either trends or changes in the art. Sort of a big picture way of intentionally distorting things to get some things more clear. And in some ways, I was doing a longitudinal squint at my life, and things did become clear. A lot of things that became clear were how imperfect my memory of items was. I found out that things that I had as my personal narrative for decades were not correct. I was changing, or something that I thought that I didn't know, that I thought never happened, had happened. And I thought, how could I not have remembered that event? So I went through an evolution, and that's the source of squint. I applied that artistic technique in looking at my life.
I love that. That's like the best thing I've ever heard.
I think it's very inspirational for all of us to take that approach, sometimes take a step back and look at it and then zoom in on those details and really help make sense of it all. Because when you're in the middle of it, like I think you both highlighted this in the stories and science, sometimes it's really hard to step back and appreciate it. That's why we always hear, hindsight is 20/20. But when you're in it, sometimes you really wish you had that hindsight. So that's a beautiful explanation, Margaret. We do have another question from Matt. And I think this is for both of you, I think would be an interesting perspective to hear your responses. But Matt asks, when dealing with siblings that are all quote unquote, gotta handhold mom and dad like a kid versus me being much more direct and to the point in the moment, how do you bridge that gap? Maybe the question is, how do you determine how mom or dad wants to be approached? Maybe an example or two if you have them.
I think for me, again, this is like my corporate brain, have a pre-meeting with your siblings and evaluate strengths and maybe weaknesses, right? Who can step in when, and then add mom and dad into the fold because they are very much a part of this. I think sometimes when we try to do what's best for other people without actually asking what they want or what they need is sometimes part of the issue. And I think saying to them, like, when do you need handholding and when do you need us to be direct? What does that look like for you? What are your goals in doing this? Because I think part of, what Margit was saying, what I've been saying is and, Ellen and Heather, all of us are saying like success, operationally defining success is the most important step in downsizing a lot of times. And then you can start to add in your pieces and move them around the board accordingly based on people's strengths or interests or likes or stamina at that point. Sometimes you need to say I need a break. And knowing that about yourself, that self-awareness piece for me is the most important part of the process. So I think there's a time and a place to be direct. Like, listen, you got 2 lamps in front of you. The truck is almost full. I need you to pick one. And if you want to pick both, that's fine, but you got to be okay with it being on top of the truck and it might not making it all the way down to Sarasota. I think that's important. So having that element with the hand holding of it's okay, I get it. This is stressful. This is a lot, is a really wonderful mix and a wonderful balance, but understanding how and when and where those strengths play can be something that's really important. And then again, asking your parents, when do you want to be handheld? When would you like us to be direct? Because then it also gives them and empowers them to be a part of that conversation.
I think there are inherent challenges as people evolve and roles evolve. My husband and I spend a great deal of time at the southern shore of Maryland, although we have a home also in suburban Philadelphia. And 5 years ago, we were in Maryland, and my husband had a really severe heart attack. He's fine. But we live with the best healthcare in the world, but we chose to have our medical crisis 3 hours from Baltimore and Philadelphia. And recently, we had surgery back in Philadelphia. He had a remarkable recovery. But just recently, he was ill and we were worried. It turns out it's fine. But my daughter said, it's really pretty selfish of you to live that far away, because you're putting yourself under a lot of risk and harder for us if something happens. And I had to say, you're right. We are choosing to have risk. And over a glass of wine one night, let's talk about the risk you choose to take and how you live your life, and risks that we're going to continue to take. And I can understand children being concerned when their family members do things that they feel make their lives risky. That maybe having more things, it could be having things on the stairs, it could be where they live, it could refusing to go into a more supportive environment. There's so many ways we can say it's risky. It could be not being compliant with your medication, versus individuals having the right to make bad decisions or just their decisions, whether they're bad or not, because no one says at 45 you shouldn't have the right to make that decision. You have the right at 45 to be non-compliant with your medication so these are natural struggles, I think, that happen as people evolve. And if we're lucky, we won't react when a kid says you're being selfish, or when an adult, when a parent says something, because we could choose to get upset, or we could find a way to disarm the discussion into something more general. I'm proud and happy with myself when I succeed in not having that emotional immediate reaction. I have a whole wall of things I do wrong and have done wrong my whole life. So every time I feel that I handle something well with my kids, I go, I want to give myself a star, because I have a lot of demerits already that I regret when I didn't handle them the way I wish I would have. So I like to give myself stars when I do.
It's interesting too, when I hear you talk, I'm like, and I have 3-year-old twins. It's like, no one likes to be parented. Like, my children don't like to be parented. I don't like when my mom tries to overparent me. And I know for a fact she doesn't like when I overparent her, and my grandmother, right? So I think that when we treat people like adults, or we meet them where they're at, and we give them choice, and we allow them to be a part of the conversation, and we allow them space to make their own decisions, whatever they may be, I think that there's something inherently healthy about that, of that psychological safety of, I'm not going to judge you for the decisions you make. Maybe I will, but maybe not to your face. But I'm allowing you to make them. I'm empowering you to make them. So if that's what you want to do, great. Boundaries are also something that are really important, I think, here. So if you're helping as a helper, or if you're the one being helped, setting boundaries of, you're not going to speak to me that way. We can attack the problem. We're not going to attack each other's personalities. We're not going to do that. Setting boundaries like, you have me for 3 hours. We can have lunch, or we can do work together, but I have 3 hours. So again, like setting those boundaries, and there's a nice way to say them. The Jersey girl in me is like, period at the end of each sentence. You can round them out. That's okay. But I do think that there's something also about boundaries in the way that we have these conversations to allow people to coexist at the same time, because boundaries are the intersection where I can love me and you simultaneously. And I think like that's something that I'm hearing you talk about, and it rings true almost at any phase and stage of life. Whether you're parenting monstrous 3-year-olds, or, sometimes like you're telling your adult children like, hey, listen, I'm still your mother. Don't speak to me that way.
I think it's actually that illusion of control comment from earlier plays in here, right? So the adult child is trying to exert some level of control because they're scared. And because they only have so many resources, whether it's financial or time, to be of support, right? So they're trying to exert control. And the parent in this scenario, whatever age they are, is like, yeah, I'm a grown adult. Thanks very much. I'll make my own decisions. Right. So they're like, yeah, I'm firmly in control of my own life. So I think it's actually this like battle of these control mechanisms that are playing. And I do wonder sometimes, and I bet Heather can speak to this too, but like sometimes there's like, I hear you, I respect it. How can I support it so it doesn't drive me off a cliff? Right. I think you have to sometimes be brutally honest about like, I need to be able to survive this decision too. Can you help me out? Throw me a bone? Can we do X to like let us all sleep well at night? And there's a lot there. I know that we're coming close on time. Are there any other questions, Heather, in chat or directly to us? I hate to like ruin the party.
Any other questions, folks? We have any last minute burning questions for either Margit or Daryl? Please pop them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll be wrapping up this evening's with Artifacts on a fascinating topic. I know that I myself have a lot of lessons I'll be taking home with me tonight and probably applying over the weekend as well. So I think it's been a great conversation. The stories, Margaret, really help people, I think, relate and to connect. And like Ellen said earlier, it does, like they will stick in our minds as examples. And then Daryl, I will admit, Daryl and I both went to the same alma mater. I was a cognitive neuropsychology major for 2.5 years, and that's a mouthful, but I love how you approach it with the science. And that speaks to me. Like Ellen and I are both data junkies, but getting the science behind it, it makes me have, I think, put even greater emphasis on the validity of the story. So merging those two together. I don't see any final questions in chat. So with that, I do want to thank both Margit and Daryl. Thank you so much for your time tonight, leading us in the conversation with the stories and the science. It was a fabulous, fabulous dialogue. I want to also, all of our folks who are tuning in tonight, if you want to catch the recording, if you want to share with friends after the fact, we will be posting the recording on our YouTube channel tomorrow. Just search for Artifacts, ARTIFCTS, and you will find it there. And then next week, we'll be wrapping up our final of 5 for the spring series of Evenings with Artifacts. We'll be welcoming Sarah Reeder and Tansy Ward to discuss the art of collections, diving into the hows and the whys, what collections speak to us, how do we even get into a little bit about managing them and caring for them, but really everything you ever wanted to know about collections. We'll be joined by experts in the appraisal and art fields to really help us dive into that. So with that, oh, and Ellen, one more thing.
And we do have a surprise guest that will pop into the Evenings with Artifacts next week. It's actually a member of the arty community who has been prolifically artifacting only collections. And so we're going to talk, and she's going to share the why behind her collections. And I think it's going to be really fun to have an arty community member join. Thank you, Heather.
Great. So with that, again, a big thank you, Margit and Daryl. Really appreciate you joining us tonight. Thank you for sharing your expertise and wisdom. It was a pleasure having you both on Evenings with Artifacts.
You're welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.